All right, everyone. Welcome to the Sphere podcast. And the first thing I want to say is that this is our first ever episode that we're recording. So it's going to be awful.
Way to sell it.
Yeah, no. All of the problems are gonna happen. We have to assume, and all of the problems are on me. You can see my very professional studio, which is also my home office. You can see all of the unprofessional things. So I want to apologize in advance for the future disaster, and I want to thank you, Con, for being my guinea pig for this experience. I want to introduce you very briefly, but you're going to introduce yourself. You're currently at the Washington Examiner. You used to work on the Hill before, and you and I have known each other for a long time. And you've always been very smart, and I've always found everything you have to say very interesting. And now you have a book, which has a very good title. So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we can talk about the book.
Absolutely, you're way too kind. Honored to be here. So my name is Conn Carroll. I'm the commentary editor for the Washington Examiner. Before that, I was with Senator Mike Lee as communications director for 7 years on Capitol Hill there. And I do have a new book out that was born out of my time on Capitol Hill. It's called Sex and the Citizen: How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. And I hope Pascal has some good questions for us today.
Yeah, so I started laughing with myself because you said my book came out of my experiences on Capitol Hill, and the book has the word sex in it.
That's fair. That's fair.
I always like it when conservatives have books with the word sex in it, because you can tell it's going to be good because it's a topic we like to dance about. So what's the argument of the book? What's the basic thesis of the book?
Well, the basic thesis of the book is that marriage is fundamental to us as humans. Even before civilization, marriage existed, and that it is the uh, foundation of happiness, of thriving, of human cooperation, and it has been throughout human history. But that since pretty much the 1960s, 1970s, marriage has been falling apart in the United States because of a kind of coordinated effort by a progressive liberal elite to undo and take apart the foundations of marriage and the nuclear family in the United States, and that this has led to deterioration of the nuclear family and marriage, so that fewer than half of all households in the United States now feature a married couple. It used to be throughout the American history, as long as there's been a census, about 80% of households have had featured a married couple. Now it's below half. And then I detail through the book all the bad effects this has on wealth inequality, income inequality, polarization, crime, uh, birth dearth, any problem you can think of today uh, that afflicts the United States stems from the deterioration and the fall apart and the end of marriage. And then the last chapter of the book is what we can do about it. And basically, there's hope. There's a lot of things we can do about it because there's a lot of bad policies stemming from the federal government that we can change to, as the chapter is titled, make marriage great again.
Make marriage great again. So as I understand it, there's like two interesting things about the book that I want to discuss, and I'm sure there's plenty of others, but
I was about
there's
to say, hopefully more than two.
I said very. No, so the first thing is, well, the book isn't called Marriage and the Citizen, it's called Sex and the Citizen.
Yes.
And there's this idea which today seems crazy to most contemporary people, and particularly in the United States, I would say, but which was taken for granted for basically all of human history, which is that because in large part because sex produces babies, but also because it's sort of psychologically the word that came to mind is perilous, but I don't want to sound like a fusty anti-sex conservative, but it's sort of weighted with sort of psychological consequences. Society has an interest in regulating it. Um, and obviously today that's a very shocking idea, and not just on the left, but also on the right, whether it's the sort of more, I mean, libertarian-ish sort of small L liberal limited government conservative, or the sort of new barstool type right. Um, so I wonder if you could talk about that idea.
Sure. So I think what a lot of people don't realize is that you have the regulation of who has sex with whom predates civilization.
Yes.
It comes from how we organized ourselves in the small hunter-gatherer bands that spread to 7 continents and conquered the world. And that in these small settings, um, the foundational unit was a man and wife, a husband and wife unit. Um, you When you encounter hunter gatherers across the world, there has never been an encounter of any group, any society where you had like a promiscuous horde, where you had just people sleeping with people. Everywhere you go, you have people pairing off. Now, people, think about, well, what about all of these polygamous societies across the country, across the world? I'm sorry. And that is very true. And in fact, there's a whole chapter in my book about the polygamous world order. But what people don't understand is that polygamy came after the monogamous hunter gatherer beginning. It wasn't until you had societies that were becoming sedentary and you had started having wealth inequality that you had polygamous societies. And then not only did you have them, but you had them everywhere. You look at any large empire throughout history, it was a polygamous society that, by the way, also had slavery. This was just as the chapter of the title of the chapter of the book or chapter of that the title of that chapter implies. This was worldwide. You look at the Mongols, you look at uh, Africa, you look at China, you look at the Vikings in Europe. Everywhere you go, slavery and polygamy side by side. And so it really wasn't until Christianity that you have a change back to monogamy. And so what Christianity does is through by trying to enforce these new monogamous norms, which of course rich, powerful men pushed back against. So the church had to
Right.
have the overall plan to do this. And they developed what Joseph Heinrich, who is a professor at Harvard, has called the Marriage and Family Program, which includes no cousin marriages, which includes no property rights for illegitimate children, which focuses on consent for the married parties. And so, what this does is by outlawing cousin marriages and by making children outside of marriage illegitimate, it breaks down the power of these patriarchal clans and allows for other civil society to emerge, guilds, universities, civic associations, etc., that take over this patriarchal power structure. And this is then the foundation for democracy, capitalism, and everything that makes the West wonderful today. Um, and unfortunately, our libertarian friends, just forget all this, and they're very much kind of focused on a John Millian um, idea of culture can be just as oppressive to us as our individuals as government can, and that's just not true. So much of what we do and accomplish as humans together through cooperation depends on cultural norms, and without the cultural norms for monogamy and for marriage, you just have civil society that democracy depends with falling apart, and that's what we're seeing in America today.
Right. So that was the second thing I wanted to talk about, which you sort of touched on, which is your book includes a kind of history of marriage, and shows how marriage evolved. And this is sort of back to the the discussions around same sex marriage, people are like, "Oh, marriage has constantly evolved," and like part of the answer is yes. Like it took millennia to find a model that works, so let's not mess with it. But I wonder if you could go a little bit more into your history of marriage and what changed. I mean, you sort of touch on it, Christianity, but um yeah, and I can give my objections to to your history once you've laid it out.
Sure, sure. So I think I, pretty much mostly laid it out so far. But we can get into a little bit of, a lot of the um, people will note, say, oh, well, Christianity didn't create monogamy. Monogamy existed in first Greece and then Rome. And that's not entirely not true. Greeks and the Romans did have a type of monogamy, but I call it unilateral monogamy. In that the Greeks and the Romans had a monogamy that was enforced on the wife, but very much not so on the husband. So if you were a Greek citizen or a Roman citizen, um, and you were a man, you were not allowed to have sex with other men's wives. But when it came to concubines, mistresses, slaves, unfortunately young boys, uh, it was free game. You were
Yep.
not only was it allowed, it was encouraged. It would be somewhat surprising if you didn't have a number of mistresses on the side that you were uh, having sex with. And so it really wasn't until Christianity that you had a reciprocal expectation of monogamy, and that's what really did make it different. Is that you have um, the man is every much as expected to be faithful to the wife as the wife is to be faithful to the man. And that was new. It was came out of the concept of just the equal dignity of all humans, and it was an idea that for a number of reasons spread throughout the Roman world and was able to reinsert itself as the dominant norm throughout um, civilization. So even today, I have the exact number in my book, but I think it's like either like 25 or 20% of the world is still living in polygamous cultures. But the vast majority of us are now in monogamous cultures, and most of it was peaceful. Sometimes it wasn't. The Spaniards landed in Mexico and enforced their values on the native population. So that was we'll put
The
that in the
far
less
right again.
we'll put that in the less consensual column. But after the end of World War One, you have Russia, Japan, China, India, just a slew of countries all voluntarily changing their laws and saying, you know what, the West has this right. Polygamy is dumb. We need to adopt monogamy, and it's been working out for a lot of nations.
Yeah, I mean, so the my sort of experience with this. I mean, it's not personal experience, but
You have personal experience with monogamy, I hope.
yes, my personal experiences with monogamy. But I was going to talk about polygamy. Like one of the
Okay.
things that you read in like the journals of European explorers in Africa in the 19th century, these societies were just extremely cruel. Just because, of course, you have, and sort of sub-Saharan Africa sort of was the a sort of paradigmatic example because it was still very close to hunter-gatherer models, and so you really had like the village and like the chief with like 40 wives, and which obviously leads to all these extra men who you need to then either kill or enslave or um and it was just deeply you can sort of sense that you're dealing with a society where like cruelty is just sort of part of the fabric of life, and in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
way that is just very hard for us to even imagine. There's this I'm going to get the reference wrong, but there's this passage by a an explorer where he arrived, English explorer, I think, in East Africa around Uganda or some Great Lakes region anyway. And he arrives to this village, and it's like utopia. Like it's everything is beautiful, and it's like this peaceful village, and so on and so forth. And he goes for a walk, and he finds the pit where they throw all the human sacrifice victims.
Yeah. No,
It's like,
you
oh,
read.
so the noble savage isn't so noble after all. And so that
I guess the only comment I would add to that is, it's the same was true of Europeans. I touch on this a little bit in my book, but Tom Holland, in his book Dominion,
yeah,
just talks about just the he calls it alien. Just there's an alien cruelty and savagery to the
yep,
Roman Empire, to the day to day torture of people in order
yep,
to maintain that order. That people, when you watch the movie Gladiator, it just doesn't touch on it. It glosses over it. I mean, you have the Gladiator, but you just the alienness of the cruelty that was going on during that time. I, us moderns do not understand.
yeah. I mean, the Rome, the BBC show Rome, is like extremely good at it, and it turns out that the guy who made it is actually a conservative. Um, Super Trump guy, but it's an excellent show, and if you haven't seen it,
I
if
have not. I'll check it out.
no, you should. It's great, and it's very good at particularly this. Like as somebody who sort of grew up in classical culture, and so I knew this stuff because if you read the primary sources, you just know. But you don't see that in sort of popular notions, popular depictions of Rome. It's like modern life with togas.
Right.
Um, and no, it's a much more cruel society. Men can divorce women with just like a by signing a piece of paper. Um, and of course, women can't get divorces at all, right? So,
Well, no.
well, yeah, it was somewhat
They would need permission from their paterfamilias.
right,
So
right.
if you
Yes,
were a
that's true.
Roman woman who wanted a divorce, and your father was against it, you were staying married. But
Right,
if for whatever reason dad was like, yeah, I don't like the way he's treating you, then that marriage was done. But
right.
you know whenever you think about what life was like in Rome, you really have to think very patriarchal, and you have to be the only real decision makers are the
Yeah,
male leaders of each family.
yeah. Um, but also that's why and this is sort of academic debate. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but I do think that the Greek and sort of Roman switch to even partial monogamy was hugely significant because
And I make that point in the book, especially with Greece, and because Solon had a number of these reforms that
yeah,
kind of first instituted um, uh, monogamy, saying, look, if you have children outside of, or basically any children outside of the one marriage, can't be citizens, right? So they're not slaves, but they
yeah.
can't be citizens, and that this really, this isn't my idea. I cite the historian. She's from USC in the book. She said this movement, kind of away from powerful men being to have
Yeah.
many family they want, really kind of solidified the idea of Greek identity and Greek citizenship as an
Oh, wow,
identity
that's
kind of apart
fascinating.
from patriarchal clans. But yeah, and that's all in the book. So I do want to make a distinction and delineation to show that yes, Christianity was a huge break, but you're right. There Greeks and the Romans did take some steps down the road to what we ended up with today. I just think that Greece was a slave society, Rome was a slave
Yeah.
society, and that these are important points that we need to remember when we talk about the great Western tradition. It's like, hold on, buddy. There's
Oh,
some
oh,
problems there.
absolutely. Um, the and there's an entire separate thing about the abolition of slavery in Europe, largely by the church. There's a wonderful like book and movie to be made if we had good Hollywood studios about the Frankish queen who abolished slavery in France in the 6th century. who was a former slave girl, and this is a true story. She was a slave girl, and the king fell in love with her and married her, and he died, and so she became the queen and like the ruler of the country. And so she didn't do an emancipation proclamation, but she a made the purchase of slaves illegal, and b decreed that the children of slaves were free. So basically, current slaves remain slaves, but
Right, right.
slavery was eliminated over a generation, and it was,
Yeah,
and and just finishing this point, sometimes you read, oh, the reason why slavery went away was because of economic progress, and therefore, it sort of became uneconomic. It's like it was the middle of the Dark Ages. Like literally, it was like the poorest period in the history of Europe, and that's when France de facto and abolished slavery. Anyway,
yeah. I
but
guess the point.
that story, if it didn't happen to make a conservative point, it would make such an incredible movie. Like, the
No, I totally agree. I think
but that movie will never be made.
well, maybe if it has a female protagonist these days, you never know.
Yeah.
And I do think that is kind of one theme of the book is how an important role women played in the spread
Yes.
of Christianity and the victory of monogamy over polygamy. In that it was very often the mothers who were Christian who often married um, pagan husbands, but then they raised their children to be Christians, and that is often how it spread. And then also Christians, because they didn't practice sex selective killing of children, they had a lot more children. When you don't put all the girls out to die, you
Right.
have a lot more children that survive into adulthood, and a lot more women who survive into
Right.
adulthood who then can spread the faith. So Constantine, obviously, very important figure in the history of Christendom. He didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome, as a lot of people think that's not true. But he did legalize it,
Yep.
and then very importantly, he allowed the church to become a legal entity in and of itself, which
Yes.
which as its own corporation that can own land, of course, is very important to the ongoing survival of the church. But his father was a pagan. His mother, however, was a Christian.
Ah, I did
And
not
so
know that.
he wasn't he was her his mother raised him not to be Christian, but definitely shared with the Christian faith, and so that's where he knew about Christianity was from his mother. When you see this over and over again, the birthplace of the Merovingian dynasty, Clotilde,
Yep.
she was Christian. She marries a pagan nobleman, and he doesn't convert right away. But a couple Christmases later, he wins a big battle, and he converts, and then you have the whole Merovingian dynasty. So you keep seeing
And
the
the greatest
common
nation
theme
in the history of the West was founded.
in some people's opinion. But yeah, the theme you see over and over again is Christian women converting their husbands, raising their sons to be Christian, and that is how Christianity spreads over time. It's not a light switch where Jesus dies on the cross and then all of a sudden, boom, the next day everyone's monogamous. No, it took centuries to get powerful men to give up the privilege of having sex with many women, and it took a long time for mostly women to establish this new norm. But thank God they did.
Um, there's so many different directions we could go. I guess so. You mentioned Heinrich, and he's written these two books that a lot of people have read, that you've read, that I've read. Um,
Weird and the secret of our success.
yes. And they sort of, you can read either one, but they sort of go together, because like the second one is like the second half of the story. Um,
I would do secret of our success first because A, it came first, and B, it's a lot shorter.
um, But I was wondering, A, can you give like a short introduction for those who haven't read the book? But B, how does his argument sort of fit into your overall thesis?
Sure. I mean, The Secret of Our Success is about humanity, and it tells much of the same story I do. I cite and I have one big block quote of text from Heinrich when Heinrich is talking about how cumulative learning. And his point is that we really are we have our own brains and everything else, but it really is the group brain
Yeah.
that is able to figure out cultural advancements and is able to advance things. And so his whole book is about the history of humanity and us being able to uh, evolve into these social learning machines that create kind of larger brains that can figure stuff out. Um, and so, in that book, he does talk about the marriage and family program of the church. My only critique of Heinrich is that he really makes it seem like this marriage family program is an accident that the
Yeah.
church kind of stumbled into, and that it has nothing at all to do with the theology or underlying philosophy of the church. Um, and I can theorize as to why that is, but I don't find it convincing. And so, I make a point in my book to say, no, 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 this is exactly where in Corinthians, Paul lays out the whole reason behind monogamy and everything else, and that there is a theoretical, philosophical underpinning for monogamy in Christianity, and it makes sense and it's true, and that's why I went on to reconquer the world. Whereas Heinrich, for all of his explaining, makes it seem like an accident.
Yeah. And yeah, no, I have the same quibble, and like you can find quotes from people like Augustine, also a case of like a female mediated conversion. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, where they speak about like why the church bans cousin marriage, and they explain it's to sort of reduce clannishness in the society, and sort of so they knew about it. They didn't do it by accident. Um, and okay, so now let's jump ahead. Let's jump ahead to America and the past 40, 50 years. Like, what went wrong and how did it all get wrong? And then after that, we can talk about how we need to establish a fascist
Sure, sure.
theocracy to
Well, like everything bad in life, the downfall of marriage starts in France. My main villain is Rousseau, and I already know
Rousseau
you're
was Swiss, damn it.
he was. No, you're right. He was not French Catholic. He was born in Geneva, and he was in fact Calvinist. So point for you. However, Rousseau really is the first one who starts talking about society um, as something that harms individual well-being and self-exploration. He has a noble savage, which in his state of nature is able to be free and be their true self. And it's not until the creation of property and civil society that is what oppresses man and makes him unhappy. And so then you have this kind of continued with Mill, who we touched on a little bit earlier. Mill's often his focus is on how the individual needs to be allowed to have, all these experiments of living so they can better find ways to live, and that the existing cultural norms are oppressing individuals and they should be allowed to free themselves. Um, I then hop across the pond and I start looking into the kind of the early days of anthropology. You have Margaret Mead, who writes about young women in Samoa, and she says it's like this free sex paradise where teenage girls have sex with whoever they want, and of course it's all face. Uh, not true. Whole books have been written going back and forth about it, but even her defenders admit that she mischaracterized it. That Samoa, like I said earlier, was part of the polygamous world order. You had Christian missionaries come in. They start establishing monogamous norms, and that is exactly what you had in Samoa. You did have somewhat more extramarital sex among teenage women, but not, not nearly as much as they're having today, and only slightly more than Americans were having at the time. So it was just a very false picture which she painted. But she rode that ticket all the way through, and she was part of a larger school of cultural relativism that was popular in universities at the time, and only became more popular. And the entire project of cultural relativism is to kind of tear down Western society, and the nuclear family. And so the next villain along these lines is Alfred Kinsey, at the Indiana University. He's a biology professor studying wasps when Indiana University wants to have a class about marriage. And so he volunteers to teach it, and he starts interviewing his students. And then you have, I think it was I'm going to mess this up, is the Ford Foundation. But then you have some big money uh, NGO come in and give him a bunch of money to study sexuality. And that's where he gets the money to do all his interviews.
Ford
And then,
Foundation.
right, right.
I
Um,
don't know for a fact that it's the Ford Foundation, but it
is
was
it the
probably
Ford?
the Ford Foundation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, whoever it was, then you have all these findings where it's like 20% of men in their cheat on their wives. 1 in 10 men is gay. All these findings that have since all been, like Mead, found to be untrue.
Yep.
And then even worse with Kinsey, we find out that he was encouraging his staff to cheat on their wives, have sex with each other, and was even filming sex in his house, all his staff. So he had an agenda. He was a pervert, but he was hugely, immensely
You can't
influential.
blame him on France in any way.
That's true. You got me there. You got me there. Indiana University. There's nothing French about that. But yeah, but he's cited in model legal penal codes. He's cited by the Supreme Court. You start having, at first it's in dissents, but you start having the Supreme Court say, hey, uh, monogamy is just one of many cultural norms that are out there when it comes to sex. Polygamy is very common around the world. It's just as valid as monogamy was. And you start
Right.
seeing that in the 40s and 50s, which is something you never would have seen in the 1870s,
Yes.
1890s, or from the founding of the country. The cultural relativism starts seeping in to the academia, and you start seeing it in court opinions. And then from there, I go into, well, I stopped briefly with Betty Friedan. And back to France with Simone de Beauvoir. Um, but anyways, coming back to the main crux of it, you have three Supreme Court cases in the span of 5 years that really kind of fundamentally undermine family law in the United States. So it starts with the 1968 case called King v. Smith. So this is a case out of Alabama where you have a woman who otherwise would have qualified for welfare challenging Alabama's man in the house rules. And so this is regulations that were allowed by the original aid to dependent children. It wasn't AFDC to begin with; it was ADC, aid to dependent children, and allowed states to regulate for deserving mothers. So if a woman's husband died, of course they were eligible. But if a woman was shacking up with a guy, then that guy she should marry that guy, and he should be providing. So she should not be eligible. So this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and Alabama argues and says, look, if you undo this man in the house rule, if you don't allow us to, regulate who gets this and who doesn't, married parents are going to be punished because if you get married, you're no longer qualify for aid to families with dependent children. But if you just cohabitate and have sex outside of marriage, then you still qualify. And if you, the Supreme Court, strike this down, you're going to have this wave of cohabitation, and marriage is going to fall apart. And the Supreme Court said, we don't care. Marriage is irrelevant. And they ruled against the state of Alabama, and you've had marriage penalties ever since. 5 years later, after that, so the King v. Smith was decided on a statutory question of how the statute was written. And it was saying, it said that because Alabama didn't offer a separate uh, remunerative program, rehabilitative program for moms, that their specific program was allowed, but that other states that were, uh, good states like New Jersey still could have it. Then 3 years later, or 5 years later, in 1973, there's another case comes along. This time, challenging New Jersey's welfare man in the house rules, and the Supreme Court says, we've thought about it some more, and there's just 14th Amendment says you can't discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate children. So that's all thrown out. And so in the next decade, you can see in the stats just the absolute bottom falls out of marriage in the African American family. So
Yeah.
up through the 50s, young African American men and women were actually more likely to be married than young white men and women. And then around about by the end of the 60s, it's just a little less. But by 1980, throughout the 70s, it's down to 20%, and it's never recovered. So that's the first case. The second case is Eisenstadt v. Baird. So a lot of conservatives look at Griswold as the big baddie of uh, family law, in that Griswold was the first to find a right to privacy, which is true. But Griswold was in the same line of cases that established marriage as the foundation of civil society. When you look at other cases like Meyer versus Nebraska, all these cases that say, look, the government can't come in and tell parents what language to teach, or send they can send their kids to Catholic school, all those things. Those cases all said the foundational unit was the married household. Griswold was within that, because Griswold said married couples have a right to contraception, not individuals. But then
Interesting.
you have Eisenstadt v. Baird, which is pre-Roe. Eisenstadt v. Baird comes along and says, look, we totally disagree. All that flowery stuff that Griswold said about the family, that's all BS. It's all about individual rights. Individuals have a right to contraception, not married couples. And of course, you've had the sexual revolution and the decoupling of marriage and sex ever since. And then the final case is Miller versus California. Here you have the Supreme Court has had a regime that allowed the federal and state governments to prosecute people for pornography. It's been successful. Pornography it exists, but it's not widespread. But just as you're having Deep Throat and Behind the Green Door, the Supreme Court comes along and rewrites this standard, very, very liberalizes it in Miller versus California. And then since then, pornography prosecutions have just dropped off a cliff, and you have the '80s boom of VHSs. Pornography's in every home, and then of course with the advent of the phone, now you have just literally endless hours of the most hardcore, disgusting pornography at everyone's fingertips, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And of course, as a touch in the book later, pornography has a number of bad effects on men in particular, and on their ability to form monogamous relationships with women. So those are the big three cases that, after you have Mead and Kinsey, spreading this cultural relativism, really takes hold in the academy, and it just undoes the foundations of American family law, and we've been suffering ever since.
Yeah. Um, Man, there's so much I wrote down to say. It's interesting that you mentioned Mill. There's somebody whose work you're probably familiar with. Gertrude Himmelfarb, I'm sorry, wrote this. She wrote several articles, at least one, which was very funny about Mill. And basically, she describes how Mill, who's seen as this sort of forerunner of feminism, was this totally basically he was his wife's toy, and like she quotes at length from these sort of abjectly submissive letters, and like she would like, so he would send her drafts of his books, and like she would just change entire things and be like, yes dear.
Yeah, I mean, I guess since you brought up Mill again, one thing that I found interesting was, Mill was alive around the time when the Mormons were in the United States, and I do spend a good chunk of a chapter on the Mormons, and people don't realize, how many cases there were that went to the Supreme Court where the Mormons were trying to protect their right to polygamy. And Congress kept upping the ante. But we don't have to get into all those cases. But the bottom line, to link this back to Mill, is that Mill basically said, I personally am against polygamy, but that's something where the government shouldn't be involved. The Mormons should be allowed to live how they want to live. And it's just like, no.
Yeah.
I mean, people should go back and
That
read.
one's on the Anglos. I'm sorry. Like
Right.
that. The
I mean, people should go back and read the Supreme Court decisions against the Mormons. There's three of them, and the language that the Supreme Court uses would just be so alien to us right now, because it was very much along the lines of, this is a Christian nation. The foundation of this nation is the monogamous married family, and Congress has every right to stamp out any resistance to it. And you read it today, and you're like, wow, what happened to that Supreme Court? Can we have those guys back again?
yeah.
Um, and maybe we do now. Hopefully we do. We'll find out.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing about blasphemy. You read Supreme Court decisions on blasphemy, and they're like, yeah, of course you can't mock Christianity. Like, are you crazy? Like, that's not what the First Amendment is for. Uh, the other thing about Simone, I mean, there's so much to say about Simone de Beauvoir, because she was such a terrible, terrible person.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, I mean, just I have a quick paragraph in the book where she was a lover of Sartre, and they very purposely chose not to get married so they could
yes,
live their alternative lifestyles. But there's a biography of her that came out later that talks about how she was a professor in Paris, and she would seduce her underage students so that
yes,
Sartre could deflower them. And she was
yeah,
basically a pimp. She was
yes.
Maxine Jaswell before we have for Epstein. But yeah, she was just clearly a gross and demented person.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so she was fired from one of her teaching jobs for sleeping with her students, and this was during the war. So later, she claimed that she had been persecuted by Vichy because of her political views, which was totally false. I mean, um, there's a couple of interesting facts about Beauvoir. One is what you described, but actually, because she kept a diary. Now we know that she was deeply in love with Sartre, and that his sort of like constant womanizing that she supported in public actually like completely destroyed her inside. Like she could not
Yeah,
stand the
if
fact
only
that
there
the
was like
man
a
she
cultural
loved
norm
was
that
sort
could
of,
have made him commit to her.
yeah. And Eric Zemmour, who's sort of famous as a once political candidate, but wrote many books. He wrote a book which has a hilarious chapter on de Beauvoir, sort of pointing out that in the second part of her life, she fell in love with like this dashing American professor, and they sort of went away together, and all of a sudden, she had dressed like frumpily. She started dressing prettily. She started doing her hair up. She started wearing makeup, and and basically, like the fact of finding like a good man just sort of like femini- feminized her or defeministed her.
Yeah, I mean, we all even despite all our ideological primping, we have deep down biological needs
Yep.
that come out that need to get fulfilled,
Yep.
even feminine.
Uh, all right. So then the next point is, now that we've sort of established this history, shown how it's sort of everything has gone downhill, what do we do about it, and how many libs can we send to camps?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have anything about sending libs to camps. But no, the thing we need to do is we need to first of all, the federal government needs to stop punishing marriage. Um, you have this welfare state, and you see this all the time with liberals, Democrats, when they talk about marriage and welfare. They say, "Oh, there's no link between AFDC and paid welfare and the decline of marriage, and the amount of payments that women get through the welfare program has fallen." And that's true. And that's true. But what they then ignore is how many other programs have expanded and grown since then. They don't mention
Right.
Medicaid. They don't mention food stamps. They don't mention Section 8 housing. They don't mention the Earned Income Tax Credit. Basically, every pillar of the modern American social welfare state punishes marriage. American spends, including the state and federal government, American spends over $1 trillion a year punishing marriage. So, right? As I point out in the book, you basically
That's the
have
headline.
yeah, you basically have two tracks in the United States. For the working class, the federal government actively punishes marriage.
Yeah.
For rich people, through Social Security and through the tax code, you reward marriage. Well, guess what?
Oh
Rich
wow. Yeah.
people are married just as like they were in the 1950s. Nothing's changed. For poor people, the bottom has fallen out of marriage. They can't get ahead, and it's terrible. So number one, we need to get rid of all the marriages in or not. No, I'm sorry, get rid of all the marriage penalties in the social welfare system, the social safety net. That's step one, and that'd be huge. Just to get the state and federal governments to stop spending $1 trillion a year punishing marriage. That's step one. Step number two is we need to make men more marriageable. So, one of my favorite studies in the book is about lottery winnings. And so, basically, when a
Oh what?
man lottery winnings. So
Okay.
when a man wins the lottery, um, he's more likely to get married and start having kids. When women win the lottery, they are more likely to get divorced. And so the reason why this is because men are sought after by women as providers. So a man who is otherwise average attractive, average earning power, if he's magically a millionaire, women are going to desire him a lot more. Whereas men, they want a loving, beautiful woman, and they really don't care about how much she earns.
Right.
And so the reason why there's more divorces, the thinking is that women may have um, chosen a man because he was a provider and not because of other reasons, like he's a good communicator, he's funny, he's attractive. And it's for those women who only married because of economic reasons. Once she's rich, she's like, I want to find someone who meets my other needs. So that's the thinking there.
Okay.
The
Making a note to not let my wife buy lottery tickets.
the takeaway from all this is that if you want to increase marriage, you have to make men more marriageable. And that, you have a lot of capitalist apologists who go around saying, and they're not wrong, that the average wage of American workers has gone up since the 1970s. True, true. However, that's largely because women have entered the workforce and are making a lot more than they used to. Average wages for men without a high school diploma have fallen in the last 50 years. So yes, for everyone as a whole, it's gone up. But for men who without a high school education, average wages have gone down. Guess where marriage is the weakest? Right in that same group. So anything that makes it harder for low skilled, low educated men to make a wage that a woman will find attractive, that harms marriage. So immigration, low skill immigration, which of course Joe Biden has flooded this country with, lowers wages, makes it harder for men to attract a wife. Trade with China. There's entire studies that show how Midwest towns were decimated by jobs going overseas, men no longer being able to make wages and start families.
I totally agree. By the way, it's just I I would love to watch like Donald Trump as president get up on a pulpit and say we need to slap tariffs on Chinese imports to sort of help marriage culture in the United States.
Well, I mean,
That would be
he's
amazing.
indirectly there, right? I mean, he's talking about making wages great again, making people so people can get jobs and get in manufacturing.
Yeah, no, but
So
it's totally true. It's just very funny to when it's put that way. But I completely agree.
right, right. So there's basically anything you can do to increase male wages, particularly for low skilled male wages, you're going to be helping marriage. Then you also just have to make a lot of things cheaper. So I talk about housing, of course.
Yeah,
Kamala Harris has touched on this, but of course the Democrats aren't going to make housing cheaper. Look at California. Look at every place the Democrats control.
right.
Housing's super expensive. Why? Because they have a bunch of environmental regulations that make it impossible to build anything. So if you get rid of what I pick on one law in particular, the National Environmental Planning Act, NEPA. Um, If you reform that, get rid of that so that people can build stuff again, including houses, you'll have a lot more construction jobs for men, which will make them a lot more marriageable, and you have a lot more cheaper houses. There's tons of research that shows that the more expensive housing is, the harder it is for young families to buy a home, the less often they get married, the less children they have. So if you
Yeah.
want more marriages, you want more children, you need to attack the housing problem. And the best way to do that is there's also zoning interests too. You want to get rid of restrictive zoning. But a lot of these democratic plans to do that are like, oh, the federal government should set a model code and enforce that on the rest of the nation. It's like, no, 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 don't. Let's not have the federal government make a model code because it'll have a bunch of environmental stuff and DEI stuff in it, and it'll suck. What HUD should do is just reward those localities that are building. If Texas and Houston are building thousands of units a year, they should get all the HUD money. And if California and San Jose aren't building anything, they should get nothing. And I think that will make the incentive for
Race
localities
to the top, but for housing.
race to the top, but for housing. Exactly, exactly. Um, and yeah, so that's the agenda.
No camps.
No cams.
No camps.
Oh, no camps for killers. I guess there are two other ones that I make it out, and this does go to the marriageable side of it, which is you have all these libertarians, God bless their souls, but they support things like online gambling, right?
Right.
People should be allowed to do what they want, but you have these new studies that are just coming out now that look at states that legalize online gambling
Yeah,
first.
no, it's terrible.
Oh, it's terrible. And of course, again, who does it hurt the most?
Yep.
Young, uneducated men. The exact same demographic that is
And
being hit the
minorities.
hardest by everything else is being hit the hardest by online gambling. So I don't care about libertarians' wishes that we should be able to have gambling. We need to, at bare minimum, ban the advertising. Ban it online, ban it over the air. We can revisit banning the apps later, which we should. But let's at least start with banning the advertising. And then, of course, we touched on this earlier, pornography, right? You have all these studies that show young men do use pornography as, unfortunately, a substitute for real human intimacy. And that's tragic and wrong and stunts their growth and terrible. And even worse, you have this epidemic across college campuses of choking. Men are
Yeah.
choking women during sex, and it comes entirely from porn. Because of the economics of the porn industry, they have this thing where you have these weird fetishes that the power users gravitate to the most. So that's what gets produced. So that's what people see, and then people think that's normal, and men think that that's what women want, and they do not. But you have this epidemic of young men choking women during sex, and of course, if you're a woman, you should be scared of sex by that point. So I mean, that's just two reasons why we need to attack the pornography industry and just make it harder for people to get to. So that's the agenda. Get rid of marriage penalties, make men more marriageable by limiting immigration, by making stuff easier to build, by stopping, by bringing back vice laws, by stopping young men from making the bad decisions that make them less attractive to women.
What about pot?
Um, yeah, no, I don't touch a lot on pot in the book, but I think that is right along those lines. Um, Pot has shown to be way more harmful than people originally thought. Um, Regular users have suffered from psychosis, depression, suicide. It's terrible.
I mean, yeah, but I mean the
And Kamala wants to legalize it.
yeah. Well, so does Trump, but
We can't all be perfect.
the so when I mean when you talk to and I've had conversations of that nature on both sides of the Atlantic. When you'll find, and maybe you've had those conversations as well. You talk to a lot of small, medium-sized business owners who are sort of conservative types, and they will tell you like, I don't like it, but I have to hire immigrants because X. And in the United States, oftentimes X is like the natives can pass a drug test. And so I really think it's a huge part of the story there. If you want to make young men, especially sort of low skill young men, employable, that's a huge part of. And I don't know. This is going to air after the election, so it doesn't matter that I said, but I can't believe nobody picked up on this. There's a passage in JD Vance's book that's specifically about this. Like he talks about he talks about like getting a job at a factory or something when he was in high school, and like all of the white kids from his town were like, getting high and therefore like showing up to work 2 hours late, or like taking bathroom breaks that lasted for 3 hours.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a huge problem.
um
I mean, I think a lot of it goes back into the fact that these men, these young boys, don't have fathers in the home to say that this is wrong behavior.
yeah.
But we've let the libertarian side win for too long. There are just way too many ways out there for young men to make bad choices that make them unmarriageable, including pot, including OxyContin, including online gambling, including pornography, and um, they need help saying no. And we once understood for a long time that it was the job of the government to help them say no,
It takes a
and
village.
it yeah, in this sense it does. And so we need to um, find ways to get rid of pot and other drugs that are destroying young men's lives, and really destroying young women's lives too, indirectly, because when young women can't find good men to marry, that causes problems.
I mean, we only have a few minutes left. I haven't come up with like a good like end of podcast gimmick yet. So I'm just gonna ask you one last question.
Sure.
The one thing you haven't talked about, which is a thing that comes up a lot in those types of discussions, and I'm just curious if there's a reason, is no fault divorce. Like usually that's like the thing that people
Look,
point to as the like before and after.
it's in the book. It's in the book. Yeah. So I mean, the short answer is yes. No fault divorce is bad for marriage. There are studies that show there are studies that show again the same demographic. Particularly men with low earning power are less likely to get married in states with that first adopted no fault divorce regimes. The thinking being that they have more to lose, and would be harder to recover from a no fault divorce than others. But yeah, the studies are there. No fault divorce does um, uh, make marriage less of an overall win for men.
Okay. Um, no, I was just wondering because usually it's like a big part of the story. Um,
No, I mean, I definitely think it's part of the story. I think because there's so many other parts of the marriage regime in different states that are bad, particularly in states like California, which is basically written by the California Lawyers Bar. So the entire system is written for the interest of lawyers, not definitely not for fathers, but not even
right.
for mothers. It's written to maximize lawyers' revenue, and it's terrible. And so no fault divorce definitely is an issue. It's definitely something that could be fixed. But you could write a whole book on divorce regimes and what actually is conducive to family stability, and what's not. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mention it.
Yeah, I mean, so my grandmother, my late grandmother who died recently, was a feminist pioneer. She was a lawyer, started practicing in the 50s, and practiced for 40, 45, 50 years. And most of her work was divorce. And so France passed no fault divorce in the mid 70s, and then you had several rounds of reforms to sort of make divorce easier, basically. Um, and what she would say, and this is on the basis of like having gone through that process hundreds of times over many, many decades, um, divorce needs to be difficult because when you get divorced, you have a lot of pent up, um, sort of resentment against the other spouse. And so you need a sort of long, difficult, drag out fight as a kind of cathartic experience. And if you don't, she would go on to say, if you don't, you take it out on the kids. If you don't have like a big divorce fight, the custody fights and those fights become the vehicle for getting back at your spouse, and so the kids get hurt in that sense. And I that's always stuck with me because you know it's not a particularly religious, it's not a theological argument. It's sort of very practical, very concrete. It's not judgmental of people who may get divorced for whatever reason. Um, but it's just striking that it never features in the conversation. Like, I mean, divorce law is not national in the U.S., but like in France, every 5 years, like I swear, every 8 years, there's a new law that says, oh, getting divorced is too complicated. Like at this point, it's harder. It's harder to fire someone in France than to get divorced. So
Yeah, I guess kind of two thoughts on that. One, as I mentioned in the book, as long as you've had marriage, you have divorce. You go back to hunter-gatherer tribes, they had divorce. Um, of course, we talked about Roman law, had divorce. Definitely, you look at the Code of Hammurabi, divorce is laid out in there. So wherever you've had marriage, you've had divorce. But there definitely has been, you know, different regimes about how easy it should be. And of course, Christianity moved much towards the direction of it being difficult. Not impossible. I mean, you still have annulments. That you still have different ways to get out of it. But this has always, to my second one, this has always been an ongoing discussion in the United States. And the founders compared the revolution to a divorce, that they were getting divorced from the United Kingdom. So they were saying, yes, divorces should be allowed as we are divorced in the United Kingdom, but they should be rare and for very, very strong reasons. But you mentioned divorce being a state issue, but one of the heroes of the book that we skipped over, I blame myself really, is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a big believer in the importance of marriage, the foundational aspect of marriage, how everyone should get married and have kids. He wrote his thesis actually on that women should have the right to vote. As a New York State legislature, he proposed a law that not only outlawed spousal abuse, which was legal at the time, but called for public flogging of people convicted for spousal abuse. But returning this back towards marriage,
now that's feminism I can get behind.
there you go. Turning this back towards divorce, in one of his State of the Unions, he called for a national divorce regime. He called for a national ban on no fault divorce. Um, you had basically the Western states famously had very liberal regimes, and Nevada would say you only have to be a resident of Nevada for like 2 weeks, and then we get jurisdiction over your marriage, and we could grant you divorce. So you had all these rich socialites in New York, training out at the time to Nevada, getting divorces, and then coming back and giving their spouses divorce papers, which he thought was a travesty. But he was, I think, the first and only president to say that we should have a national law and marriage regime, which of course never happened. But I just think it's an interesting note that yes,
It is.
people have thought, we need to fix this problem on a national scale.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time.
Buy the book,
Probably
Sex
nobody.
and the Citizen, on Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say everybody who's still watching, all five of you should definitely pick up Khan's book. You should definitely buy it, and you should also read it. Uh, thank you for your time. Thank you for agreeing to be my first guinea pig for this.
My pleasure.
Hopefully, it turns out good, and the podcast will launch sometime next month. And at this point, sales of your book will increase tenfold.
Let's hope. Let's hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.